Hey everybody, Mark here from pondalgaesolutions.com. Thank you for joining me today. In this video, I want to go back and look at a video we did in the past, almost 14 years ago, and it was called The 5 Myths of Algae Control. And that video ended up being one of the most popular ever on our channel. I think it was one of the most helpful we ever did for people because it helped them make better decisions about how they wanted to manage their pond algae issues when they came up. And it covered a variety of different myths or misconceptions that we were seeing at the time in the pond care industry, if you will. So in today's video, I want to revisit that idea. We'll talk about some of the same myths that we mentioned there with new details, more information. You can always go back and look at the old video if you like. A couple of disclaimers on it. One, the audio is not very good. It's only on one channel, and some people said my left ear loved it, but other people couldn't hear it very well. So know that that was a problem there. I do think that all the information we shared there was very evergreen. Much of it still applies today just as it did then, so I think it can be helpful. But there were a couple of things noted there for small ponds, which we don't work with as much anymore. So, you know, keep that in mind. But again, the information is still very relevant in terms of what we talked about. But today we'll cover some of those same topics in general, go into more depth, maybe some new updated information that we have on some of that, and then we'll talk about some new myths that have come up that we wanted to address in this video. So as we come to the current day, 2025, the 5 myths currently that I wanted to address here. Aeration alone will eliminate algae. That in itself, in its strictest sense, is not true. It's not possible. And you may ask, well, I've heard people say, and even you may have said, that the first thing you might do for an algae problem is put aeration in a pond. And if you look around online very much, if you look on some social media or YouTube videos, you will see, often enough, you will see people say, just off the cuff, it wasn't even necessarily a goal. They were trying to put aeration in to help their fish, but they had an algae issue, some minor algae maybe, or maybe a significant algae, and within a few weeks the algae disappeared. It went away after they put the aerator in, and they didn't do anything else. So, you know, the difficult thing here is when you see stuff like that, you think, well, aeration must have done that, but it didn't do it on its own. That's the reality. That's the truth. You can say that aeration sets the stage. It sets the foundation for supporting things that can help actually affect the algae growth. Typically, what you're doing when you see algae disappear like that is the nutrient profile, the nutrients that are feeding that algae have been affected in some way and brought down or lowered. The way that aeration does this, indirectly, is that it will increase oxygen low in the pond towards the sediment. And there is iron in that sediment that will bind to phosphorus and hold it in place, sequestering it in the sediment so that it's not available for algae in the water column. As oxygen decreases, or if oxygen is low down at the bottom of a pond, you will often see phosphorus leach out of the sediment. There's no binding or as much binding action there because of lower oxygen. So when you increase the oxygen with aeration, you got a better sequestration of phosphorus, which is a primary driver of algae. Okay, so that had an effect there. I also think that a pond, typically if it hasn't been hammered with copper-containing algicides and stuff, ponds naturally have a population of beneficial microbes, beneficial bacteria. That is nature's way of keeping a pond a bit cleaner, helps with decomposition of organic matter down there. It does a lot of things in the pond, but it's a pond cleaning mechanism, for no better word. Much of this bacteria is oxygenate, is aerobic, so it needs oxygen to function well. And so as you increase oxygen in the pond, you also get a better response out of any existing or supplemented microbes that are in there. And so aeration has a potential to improve an algae situation in a pond, but The key is not directly, not just because of the aeration alone. There are other things that it's supporting in processes that actually make it happen. So it is a myth if anybody tells you that aeration all on its own every time is going to handle an algae problem and make it go away. That's not really true. I also should say too, though, that it is also not true to say that aeration will never help with an algae problem or be a factor in it. That's not true either. And sometimes people go to one extreme or the other, and you're caught confused because you just don't think either way you're going to get anything out of it. So I think that's the honest truth behind it. There are ways that it supports a anti-algae effort. Second myth: if I kill the algae, my problem is solved. There's no question that when you use a product, a chemical, an algicide, or let's say you call a pond management company in and you say, I've got this algae problem, can you please take care of it? I want it to look better. And they're obviously going to do what you want. They're going to take a product, they're going to treat the algae, and within a couple days that pond is probably going to look pretty good, pretty pristine. It will all disappear to the eye. But the question is it really gone? And the answer to that is no, it's not gone. It died. It sank, and it is now decaying at the bottom of the pond. That biomass, that organic material, that plant material, is going to decay and basically become like compost at the bottom of your pond. What does compost do in a garden? It is intended to nutrify the soil, which helps plants grow better. The same thing happens as you build up an accumulation of biomass at the bottom of the pond. Plant matter, organic matter, as it decays, it releases nutrients into the water that will feed new growth, which will require the process to be done all over again. So the algae really isn't gone, and the problem really isn't solved. Algae, and think about this, algae is a symptom of the primary problem. That primary problem is excessive nutrients in the form of phosphorus primarily, but it also could be nitrogen. And so unless you're working to address the root cause of why the algae is growing so well, you're not really, quote unquote, solving the problem. You're using a Band-Aid to deal with it, which at times is important. It's useful. It's a tool like everything else that we talk about. It may be useful to do it. Let's say treat it with an algicide, but it may not be the best long-term answer. So, myth number 3, ultrasound is the answer to all my algae problems. Everything I ever wanted to achieve against algae, I can do with ultrasound. Nope, not going to happen. Ultrasound is a pretty good tool in the right situations, in the right settings. We use it a lot on larger water where it may be excessively expensive to either treat it with something, even a chemical, or to aerate it or do much of anything else. Ultrasound could be the best bang for the buck there. But there's 2 criteria that I use, and I don't know how many others talk about this. Other manufacturers I don't think necessarily bring it up, but for the people that I tend to work with, we talk about it all the time. We pre-qualify the ultrasound systems to make sure that they will be a better fit for your situation, and we do that in 2 ways. One, we test the algae species. We want to know what's in there. Even though ultrasound will control the vast majority of algae that you will run across, it has gotten better over the years, more effective and more efficient, but there will probably always be a few species that, because of their cell structure and just how they're designed, they have the ability to withstand more agitation, more vibration than what the device is going to put out. Keep in mind that the goal with this system is not to just disrupt and destroy the entire ecosystem in a pond. It doesn't use cavitation or real excessive power to do the job. It is a subtle action in a pond so that it's safe for everything else. But when those vibrations are targeted to the algae cells, frequency specifically, it will agitate them or disrupt them enough to where it can eventually kill them. But there's some algae that it is just not able to do that, at least at the current time and in its current state. So you want to know what algae you're dealing with by species, not just general class. whether we're talking about cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, string algae, filamentous, whatever you want to call it, all those broad classifications. It can work on the vast majority of species in those classes, but species specifically, we need to know what's in there so we can determine if something is in there that it won't handle well. Number two, because phosphorus, which again is a nutrient I just mentioned, is such an aggressive driver of algae growth. If phosphorus is over 200 parts per billion in a pond, if it's quite excessive, ultrasound on its own is probably not going to keep up with the growth rate of the algae. It could literally outpace the device's ability to kill it. And so you would want to know that ahead of time and consider ways that you can lower that phosphorus level to an acceptable level. It doesn't have to be zero, but it definitely has to be below 200 parts per billion so that the device can actually do its job well. So we check those two things before we even get too deep into the discussion on ultrasound. If it's something someone is interested in and it looks like the fit is right, then we might look at it. A lot of it too depends on what you're spending cost-wise to treat a problem currently. These systems are not inexpensive necessarily. I mean, everybody is all over the place on what they consider affordable and not, but if somebody's spending thousands and thousands of dollars a year to treat an algae problem with chemicals or what have you, then maybe one of these systems makes sense. If you have a pretty small pond, if it's generally well managed, if you don't have too big of a problem, it may not be worth the investment. So those are things to consider with ultrasound. Fourth myth. Algicides, primarily those containing copper, are a safe long-term solution to an algae problem. They are maybe a good short-term solution if you have the need for them. If I have a toxic algae bloom in a public setting, a place where both pets or animals and people could be at risk of toxicity from this algae, and this is a growing concern in many places around the country. The things that are driving this growth, high phosphorus, high nutrients, they aren't going down. And so you're seeing more and more reports of toxic bloom notifications and stuff. And you know, if you have one of these in a situation where people are at risk and pets are at risk, I'm not really one to put off dealing with it. And you may want to use a algicide or a product to knock the thing down and bring it under control in the short term while you work on some other ways to help mitigate it. And then again, we go back to why is algae there in the first place? High nutrients. How do we deal with those nutrients? Well, we want to look at their sources. If we can mitigate and lower or reduce the influence of those sources on our pond, then we would do that. But that's where the big work starts. That's where the important stuff starts. At best, I would look at an algicide as a short-term Band-Aid solution. They are not good long-term because algae can develop resistance to copper applications. Also, as I mentioned before, every time you kill that algae that you see blooming, every time you kill it, you're adding to the biomass of the pond. It doesn't go away. It sinks to the bottom and it begins to decay. And as you get this buildup, you simply get more nutrients to feed more growth. The second downside to the copper-containing algicides is that this copper is detrimental to naturally occurring bacteria, the beneficial bacteria that is so important to helping keep a pond clean and balanced and helping reduce organic buildup and muck and sludge and all that stuff. The copper will kill that too. So it never really gets up to speed on what you're hoping to achieve with either supplemented bacteria or natural bacteria. You basically neutralize all that cleaning effort. So that's not a good thing. And if your pH swings a little bit, if it's too high or too low, copper algicides can either be ineffective or a very short-term solution at best, or they can become toxic to fish. So that's very problematic. There are peroxide algicides which are used from time to time. I might suggest them for a knockdown, but they really don't provide a long-term residual solution to a problem. Algae will often grow back pretty quick if the nutrients aren't addressed. And so there's issues in all those things. Now, we do on occasion use what I would call a fairly special copper-based algicide called EarthTech, which we like, and we use it as a restricting mechanism or a treatment to keep new growth from coming. If we can knock an existing bloom down and then use EarthTech as a maintenance dose tool, we can use it to try to keep new blooms from forming. And then I think that it has, if you're going to use an algicide at all, you want to use it in a way that prevents new blooms from occurring over and over again, not just treating a problem once it's shown up. So that's my take on algicides. I don't think they're a great long-term solution. The fifth myth, beneficial bacteria will remove phosphorus in my pond. Well, not really. Beneficial bacteria will help more with nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up online, but it's how ammonia is processed into nitrites, and nitrites are converted into nitrates. Nitrates are then used as a safe nutrient for plant growth and things like that. Well, beneficial bacteria will help with the conversion in this process, so it keeps the pond safer for fish and wildlife and things like that. Nitrogen in some forms can be gassed out of the pond. If you have some aeration going, it may help off gas some of that. And so it's a good thing to work with in a pond environment. And we have actually used beneficial bacteria successfully. If we have an algae problem and the phosphorus isn't excessively high, then I think that's when we get a decent response using aeration and microbes and can turn an algae problem around without chemicals. But to say that beneficial bacteria will remove phosphorus from a pond, it's just not a reality. It's very hard to remove phosphorus. You can do it in a couple different ways. You can do it through, obviously, dredging. If you have nutrient-rich, phosphorus-laden, nutrient-rich muck and sludge, you can physically dredge and remove that. If you have an existing string algae bloom, a filamentous algae bloom, or a weed, let's say, and you can physically harvest and remove that biomass, you will be taking the phosphorus with it. The next best option on phosphorus is simply to bind it or sequester it and make it unavailable for the algae to utilize. And you can do that in a couple ways. We mentioned aeration helps with binding phosphorus to the sediment, keep that oxygen up down there, and you will help with that. Secondly, you can use a binding product, a flocculant, to help it basically bind up the phosphorus in the water column or cap the sediment so that the release is not coming from the sediment. And these binders, which can come in the form of alum, there are some mineral formulas that are used, there are clay-based formulas, things like that. We use a product called Metafloc, which after a lot of research, I'm finding people seem to like quite a bit. And all these binders, they have to be used in enough abundance, enough dosing, in order to bind up the phosphorus that you're trying to deal with. So the higher the phosphorus load is, the more binder you'll have to use, and then you just try to make it unavailable for the algae. But to say that it removes phosphorus from the pond, only two ways to do that. That is through either physical removal of the muck that contains the phosphorus, or removing some of the biomass that is holding some of the phosphorus and nitrogen in it. And when you pull the plant out, it takes that with it. So that's really the base reality about all that. I've got two other extra bonus tips that I wanted to share. This is beyond the 5 that we were talking about. First one is barley straw and or pond dye will fix my problem with algae. And this is an interesting, I hate to say it's a myth, because some people actually have used barley straw and found it to be helpful. And so if you have done that, and if you have found it to be successful, then by all means continue to use it. But a lot of people talk about it, a lot of people try it, and they don't see very good results. And most of the university research that I've seen on barley straw, and some studies have been done on it, it's really mixed. It does not do very well as a treatment to an existing problem. People have found it to be useful to keep algae from forming. So it may be used as a deterrent, but probably not as much as a treatment. That's one way to look at it. If you can find it cheaply enough, close to home, direct from the farm, where you're not having to ship it in and pay exorbitant prices for that, I think it's worth a try. But be realistic in your expectations and know that a lot of times it's not going to help very much. Pond dye is another thing that we get asked about a lot, and there are certain cases where you might find pond dye useful, but it does have some downsides to it. It can be somewhat disruptive to the ecosystem. You want, especially with fish ponds, you want to have a nice, vibrant, balanced array of aquatic critters in that ecosystem, and that includes some algae, that includes diatoms and things like that, that really start the food chain base, and everything builds up from there. And so dye can inhibit some of that stuff. And you know, if you have some weed growth, particularly low, and maybe algae growth low in the pond, and the pond might be shallow and it's picking up some sunlight, photosynthesis, even though, you know, it's a few feet down, you may want to think about trying pond dye. It's safe, non-toxic, but I wouldn't bank on it being a full-on solution to the problem. If it helps, if it kind of stacks the deck against algae a little bit with some other things, think about using it. But I wouldn't stick with it for long if you're not seeing it helpful. Let's put it that way. And finally, the last myth, and that is all algae are bad. There's this prevailing thought or idea that just because you have some algae, or maybe you don't have clear water, that there's a problem. Healthy ponds are not typically just pristine. They don't look like a bathtub. You know, they have some coloration to the water, some tint to the water. You may even see some growth around the pond from time to time. And as long as it's not excessive, that actually to me indicates a really healthy pond and a healthy ecosystem. I don't care to see heavily dyed ponds that look like toilet bowls. I don't like to see, you know, if the water is clear and naturally clear, and it's basically you've got a healthy population of fish and you've got some nice activity and growth is good and everybody appears healthy, I'm not going to argue with some clearer water. But it may not always be the primary goal. Balance and just an overall healthy ecosystem is really the most important thing, even if your water doesn't look perfect. And a little bit of algae, you know, is really necessary, as I said, for the food chain structure. You want to have that. And so not all algae are bad. Most algae are useful and helpful in moderate amounts. It's when they get excessive and outgrow their ecosystem, you might say, that they start to cause problems and disrupt a lot of the balance in the pond, and then you may want to do something about it. So at any rate, that's kind of the rundown on the 5 myths. So I hope you found that helpful. I think it's a nice extension or an update to the old video where we talked about those original 5 myths. As you can see, there's more and more out there all the time, and we may do another one down the road with a few more that we come up with. But as always, if you have any questions, comments, etc., you can leave those in the comment section below. If you have questions or need help with your pond in any way, reach out to me. My name is Mark at pondalgaesolutions.com. And again, thanks for joining me. I hope you have a great day wherever you are.